Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. We're going to continue our lecture today talking about ecology. Specifically, today we're talking about something known as invasive species. And whether you know what this term is or not, you probably know some examples of invasive species. So let's go ahead and get the ball rolling and see what we're talking about today. Okay, so what is an invasive species? An invasive species are those that are introduced into new environments. Invasive species typically cause ecological, environmental, and economic damage. Invasive species can be transported deliberately or accidentally. When a new species is introduced to an environment, they are often outside of the food web and do not have any natural predators. This means that they often reproduce at a high frequency. A population of organisms reproducing unchecked can have a disastrous effect on an ecosystem, and we're going to talk about some examples of these invasive species. So one example I wanted to talk about is kudzu. If you live in Mississippi, you probably know what this is. It's very common, especially in the north part of the state and in the delta. So what is kudzu? Well, it's this vine that you've probably seen before. It's actually naturally from Japan, and what was going on in America in the early 20th century, we were having a lot of erosion problems. And so somebody thought, hey, let's bring this vine from Japan over. This is a very quick growing plant. It can grow up to a foot a day. And so their idea was, let's bring this over, we'll put it in the areas where there's a lot of bad erosion. The roots will grow into the ground and hold that soil in place. It seems like it's going to work, but what they didn't realize is that here in the United States, nothing eats this kudzu, right? And so what happens is it just grows and grows and grows, and nothing can stop it. And now today, like I said, if you drive around parts of the state, you'll see, even in this picture, there's trees that you can't even see in this picture. They're totally covered in kudzu, right? And so then later on, when it's really starting to grow unchecked, some farmers thought, well, it grows so quickly, we spend a lot of money feeding our cattle, let's just have the cows eat this kudzu. And again, it seems like it's going to work on the, on the front of it, but what ended up happening was, because the kudzu is not in the cow's natural diet, when they were eating it, they were getting something called bloat, which basically means their body wasn't very good at digesting it, and they were filling up with gas a lot, and that's a pretty dangerous thing for cows. So kudzu, this is also dangerous because these trees that are underneath the kudzu, they're having to work a lot harder to get sunlight and water. They're having to outcompete this species that's not really natural to their environment. And the trees in this picture, they might have predators that eat them or use them for habitats, but nothing knows what to do with the kudzu. And so it just keeps growing and growing unchecked. Let's talk about another example of an invasive species. This is in Florida. These are Burmese pythons. So in Florida, this is it's a big area for the animal trade, sometimes legal, sometimes illegal. And also during one of the hurricanes, a snake sanctuary got destroyed and released a lot of these pythons. So the Everglades in Florida is pretty close to the Burmese python's natural habitat, so they started to do really, really well in this area. However, because the Burmese python is invasive and is not natural to this area, nothing hunts it. And so now if you go down to the Everglades, where there weren't any Burmese pythons to begin with, now there's a lot of them, and they're growing and reproducing unchecked. And here, in Florida, I know that they have crocodiles and alligators, but here you can see that this Burmese python is just killing one of these. So, it's a very dangerous situation to be in, where these animals are very dangerous to other animals, to humans, and nothing hunts them naturally, so they just keep getting to reproduce unchecked. And eventually we might get to a point where the Burmese pythons outnumber a lot of the natural organisms from this area. So that's the main thing with invasive species, is that they're in an environment that they're not naturally in, nothing hunts them, and so they just keep growing and growing and growing. Okay? So I wanted to switch it up a little bit, and instead of invasive species, I want to talk about something known as biomagnification. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at what this is talking about. So what is biomagnification? Well, biomagnification is the buildup of a substance, such as a pesticide, in organisms at higher levels of a food chain. This occurs to a couple different things. So one is persistence. A substance that resists being broken down in an environment is going to stay in organisms and in the environment for a little bit longer. If a pesticide or some sort of chemical is fat soluble, that means it's not going to be excreted when an animal uses the bathroom. If it's fat soluble, it means it gets put into the fat in your body, and that means your body's going to hold on to these pesticides. Okay, another thing that can cause this to happen is trophic transfer. So predators consume multiple prey, which increases the concentration in their bodies. And I'll show you a picture of this here in just a second. And another thing that can cause this biomagnification is the slow metabolism or excretion. If the substance is not easily broken down or removed from the body, that means it's going to stay in the organisms for a little bit longer. Okay, so let's take a look at this picture, okay? So what's going on here is that this is kind of like a food chain, right? At the bottom, or a food web, I should say. At the bottom, we see all of our producers, right? And then the next level up, those are the consumers that are eating our producers, and then you see the little fish, and then at the top, you see the big fish, okay? Every little red dot on this picture is 1 unit of a fat-soluble toxin, okay? So what's happening is at that producer level, at the very bottom, there's really not much of that toxin, right? Most of the little circles, those producers, have maybe 1 unit of toxin. Some of them don't have any, right? But look what happens when you go to the next level up. Okay, because these consumers are eating the producers that have toxins in their body, when they eat them, the toxins get put into their body. And so now look at that primary consumer on the far left. You can see it has 2 little units of fat-soluble toxins. And then if you go up to the next level, the small fish, instead of just 1 or 2, they each have 4 or 5 or 6 of these little fat-soluble toxins. And then when you get up to the top, you can see that that fish is filled with these things. And it's because he's eating everything below it. And all of those things that he's eating has the toxin in it. So what happens? Biomagnification. Bio means life, magnification means to enlarge. As you go up the food chain, the concentration of these toxins are going to increase. And this can have some really negative side effects. And I want to talk about a real life example that happened right here in the United States. So I wanted to talk about a very important book written in 1962, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It sparked the modern environmental movement and led to stricter pesticides regulation. It highlighted biomagnification, where DDT accumulated in organisms at high levels of the food chain. So let's talk about what DDT is. This is a pesticide that kills mosquitoes. Back in the day, they would have planes or trucks driving by, they're just driving through the neighborhood, and they would be blasting this fog. It would look like fog. And inside of the fog is this pesticide called DDT. My mom told me that when she was a little kid, they would actually run behind these machines. They didn't know how dangerous they were at the time. So what would happen is, okay, so the DDT, it's killing the mosquitoes. That's a great thing. But what we figured out years later is that that DDT wasn't just disappearing. It was staying in the ecosystem, and it was working its way up the food chain. In fact, it was working its way all the way up the food chain. What happened was that it was observed that DDT was weakening bald eagles' eggshells, causing them to break before hatching. So however the chemical DDT was killing the mosquitoes, when it got into the bald eagle population, what was happening is that for whatever reason, when they were laying these eggshells, the shells were very, very weak. They couldn't support much weight. So the bald eagle would go to its nest and sit on its eggs to keep them warm and just crush all of her eggs, which is such a terrible thing. I mean, imagine that happening to a mother, but also the bald eagle is America's animal, right? And so we were kind of driving our national animal into extinction by using these pesticides. So what happened next was it was linked to DDT. exposure to declining bald eagle population and other bird species. Through a lot of research, we figured out what was going on here. This led to the U.S. banning DDT in 1972, and now our eagle population is recovering. And this story really demonstrated the interconnectedness of ecosystems and the dangers of human impact on nature. So yeah, this story, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962, really started the environmental movement. And the name of the story is very important to me as well. So Silent Spring, it all started from, she walked outside of her house one day down to the spring on her property, and she went out there and she was looking at the water, and she was just kind of surprised that she didn't hear anything. She didn't hear birds chirping, she didn't hear bugs buzzing. It was silent. And the reason it was silent was this DDT had killed off the mosquitoes, it had killed off these different insects, and it was working its way up to the environment. It was killing the birds because the eggshells were being broken down. And so, yeah, you know, it was quiet. It was too quiet. And she knew that that was a bad sign. And she went out there and wrote this book and really helped change the use of this chemical in our environment and help bring the bald eagle population back up to a healthy level. So thank you all so much for making it here today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.